The 426 Hemi is legendary, but why? I'm David Freiburger, and I'm going to show you 20 moments that made the Hemi great. You know the 426 Hemi as the engine that so famously came in Dodge and Plymouth muscle cars from 1964 to 1971. But it really all began in late 1963. As a matter of fact, the very first blocks were cast in December of 1963. And this engine was based on the existing big block architecture, but it had cylinder heads with hemispherical combustion chambers very similar to the Chrysler Hemi of the 50s. The thing is, it was being engineered only for racing. And so our story begins in early 1964 at a NASCAR race. In February of 1964, the 426 Hemi attacked the Daytona 500, the race that the engine was built to win. Now, I told you how they had cast those blocks in December of 1963. Well, they had a problem cracking, and so they had to cast more in like the first week of February, and the race was just a couple weeks away. Meanwhile, the Hemi was preparing to dominate. There was twin 100-mile races before the Daytona 500, and they were both won by Hemis, by Junior Johnson and Bobby Isaac. When it came to race day, qualifying was once again dominated by the Hemi when Paul Goldsmith just smashed all the records for qualifying at the track. And then in the end, the Hemi took first, second, third, and fifth. Richard Petty won that race and 9 others that year and took the championship. The 1964 Daytona 500 is the moment that the Hemi began. People don't realize that the Hemi almost made its debut in drag racing even before the Daytona 500. They had them ready for the NHRA Winter Nationals in February in Pomona, but they were too slow, so they held back. And then they revealed the car in public at Detroit Dragway in April of '64. And a few weeks later, with new carburetors and a new camshaft at an AHRA event, one of the Hemis went 11:06 in the quarter mile and became the quickest quarter mile stock class car on the planet. In September of 1964, it was time for the NHRA Nationals, and the Hemis decimated the door slammer classes. Here's one example. In Super Stock, the Quick 16 was 8 Dodges, 7 Plymouths, and 1 Ford. Naturally, a Hemi won that deal, and Factory Experimental, and a couple of other classes. The world was on notice that the Hemi was here to stay. Also at the 1964 NHRA Nationals, Dan Knapp showed up with a AA fuel dragster that was the first one ever powered by a 426 Hemi. On October 19th, 1964, NASCAR banned the 426 Hemi. It was just too fast and too dominant. And in response, Chrysler said, "We're out of here," and pulled themselves out of competition for the 1965 season. In late 1964, drag racer Dick Landy did something that was going to make a huge impact on the drag racing sport. He took his Hemi 1964 Polara and radically altered the wheelbase. The whole point of this was to put more traction on the back tires, just by putting more weight and leverage on them. The thing is, that stupid-looking car was going to coin the term funny car, and it was going to change the face of door slammer drag racing for 1965. In February of 1965, NASCAR builder Ray Fox had a brand new 65 Coronet that he'd built for NASCAR, but it was outlawed, so he had to do something. So he put a supercharger on the Hemi, he put Leroy Yarborough at the seat, and they set a closed course record of 181.818 miles an hour. Also in early 1965, the Hemi was responsible for a whole new trend. It was the drag racing exhibition wheel stander. The very first one was engineered from within Chrysler. They took this A100 pickup truck and put a Hemi in the bed, and it ended up doing giant wheelies. It was the original wheel stander, followed closely by the Hurst Hemi under glass Barracuda. These cars were designed just to stand up on the rear bumper and run the full length of the quarter mile. 1965 would see the most ludicrous cars ever commissioned by an OE manufacturer. Dodge and Plymouth built 16 Hemi-powered cars with that awesome altered wheelbase inspired by Dick Landy. They acid dipped them to the point that they were falling apart just to save weight, and they sent them out match racing for the drag racing world in 1965. By June of 1965, NASCAR was sick of dwindling attendance because people wanted to see the Hemi, and they brought them back, but for short course racing only, and Hemis won 6 of those. David Pearson won the '66 championship with a Hemi, and Richard Petty in 1967 won it and had the most dominant season in the history of NASCAR. On November 12, 1965, the Summers Brothers Goldenrod used 4 Hemis to run 409.645 miles an hour. It would be the world's fastest wheel-driven car until 1991, and it held its class record for unblown cars until 2010. 1966 was the first year that the general public could buy a 426 Hemi off the showroom floor. This was inspired by needing to have production numbers for NASCAR and because of all of the great marketing that the Hemi had done in drag racing. In September of 1967, Big Daddy Don Garlits won the NHRA Nationals in Top Fuel. Now, he had a 426 Hemi in this thing because Dodge made him do it, and at the time, most of the other racers were still using the 50s 392-based Chrysler Hemi. We believe that this win by Garlits was the very first time that a 426-based engine had won a major drag racing event in Top Fuel. In 1968, Dodge and Plymouth released my favorite muscle car of all time, the Superstock Hemi Dart and Barracuda. These cars were so magical that these days they're the only car with an NHRA class just for them. Superstock A Hemi is only for the 1968 Hemi Dart and Cuda. In 1969, Dodge was out to destroy NASCAR again, and they released the Dodge Daytona for aerodynamics, and on March 24th, 1970, Buddy Baker got in a Chrysler engineering car, and on a closed track, he ran 200.447 miles an hour. It was the very first time that a car had exceeded 200 miles an hour on a closed course, and it was done with a 426 Hemi. NASCAR hurt the Hemi again in 1971, limiting the aero cars to 305 cubic inches. Bobby Isaacs solved that problem by going to the Bonneville Salt Flats and ran a big oval track there and set a ton of endurance racing records and a flying mile record of 216.945 miles an hour. In March of 1970, Don Garlits had a transmission explosion that sawed his Top Fuel dragster in half. It was a front-engined car, and in the hospital he started drawing up a sketch for a rear-engine car. It wasn't the first, but it was the most successful. He won the 1971 Winter Nationals with a rear-engine car and then followed that up weeks later at the March meet in California, and he did it with 426 Hemi power and set the world on notice that everybody was going to be going to the rear-engine configuration. Now it's 1975, and even after the rear-engine dragster conversion, a lot of guys were still running the 50s 392 Hemi until Keith Black came along. He made an aluminum 426 block that would start the change so that everybody would be running a 426 Hemi. That's the end of the history lesson. These days, the 426 Hemi has been refined by engine builders and it wins everywhere that it races, especially in drag racing. As a matter of fact, there is not an NHRA alcohol dragster or funny car that runs anything but a 426. And of course, the same is true in the nitro classes. And the quickest drag cars in the world are the NHRA Nitro Funny Car and Top Fuel Dragster, both powered by an engine with the configuration of a 426 Hemi. In the end, one of the greatest achievements was done by Danny Thompson, who took his Hemi-powered Streamliner to Bonneville and ran 448.757 miles an hour for the record as a two-way average. His top speed, 459.588. It made him the world's quickest piston-powered car. And of course, it was done with engines based on, you guessed it, the 426 Hemi.